The blood-red sun dipped low on the horizon as Prudence Miller staggered across the barren plain, her swollen feet leaving uneven tracks in the dust behind her. 3 small wooden crosses haunted her every step, though they were now miles behind her, abandoned like she had been by the people she once called family. Wyoming Territory, 1875. The land was as unforgiving as the people who scratched out lives upon it. For Prudence, 23 years of living had brought her 3 pregnancies, 3 tiny graves, and 1 devastating proclamation from the elders of Hollowbrook. She was cursed, dangerous to the community, and banished forthwith. "A woman who cannot bring life only brings death," Elder Thatcher had declared, his weathered face twisted with disgust as he stood on the porch of the general store, addressing the gathered townsfolk. "The good Lord has marked her as unclean." Prudence's husband of 5 years, Jeremiah, had stood silently among them, his head bowed in shame. He had not fought for her, not one word. The stony silence had cut deeper than the banishment itself. That had been 3 days ago. Now her water canteen sloshed emptily at her side, and the small bundle of possessions she'd been allowed to take weighed heavily against her blistered shoulder. The vast Wyoming landscape stretched endlessly before her, painted in hues of amber and gold by the setting sun. The first stars had begun to appear when she spotted a flicker of orange in the distance. A campfire. Prudence hesitated, survival warring with caution. Towns and settlements she had to avoid. The letter C, branded onto her hand, marked her as cursed to any God-fearing community, but a lone traveler might offer water without judgment. Or they might be dangerous in other ways. Thirst won the argument. She altered her course, moving toward the dancing light with unsteady steps. As she drew closer, the silhouette of a man emerged, tall and broad-shouldered, sitting beside the fire. A horse nickered softly from where it was tethered nearby. The man's head lifted suddenly, and she froze as the unmistakable metallic click of a gun hammer being drawn back cut through the evening air. "That's close enough," called a deep voice, its tone hard but not cruel. "State your business." Prudence swayed on her feet, exhaustion and dehydration clouding her vision. "Water," she managed, her voice a dry rasp. "Please." The man stood, his face shadowed beneath a wide-brimmed hat. He was taller than she'd first thought, dressed in worn denim and leather, a gun belt slung low on his hips, a cowboy by the look of him. "You alone?" he asked, his gun still raised. "Yes," the word was barely audible. As if to punctuate her response, her knees buckled, and she sank to the ground, the world tilting dangerously around her. The last thing Prudence remembered was the sound of boots crunching across the hard, packed earth and strong arms catching her before she hit the ground. When she awakened, the night was deep around her. She lay wrapped in a rough woolen blanket beside the campfire, which had been built up to a cheerful blaze. Her mouth was no longer parched, though she couldn't recall drinking. Across the fire sat the cowboy, his features now visible in the flickering light. He was younger than she'd expected, perhaps 30, with a face that spoke of long days under the sun. A strong jaw darkened by stubble, straight nose, and eyes that watched her carefully from beneath the brim of his hat. Not handsome in the conventional sense, but striking nonetheless. "You're awake," he observed, his voice less threatening than before. "Thought you might sleep through till morning." Prudence tried to sit up, wincing as her body protested the movement. "How long was I?" "Couple hours. You were half dead from thirst. I got some water into you before you went completely under." He gestured to a tin cup near her hand. "There's more if you need it." She reached for it gratefully, drinking slowly as she'd been taught. Only when she'd finished did she notice her left hand was exposed, the crude C brand visible in the firelight. Hastily, she tucked it beneath the blanket, too late. The cowboy's eyes had followed the movement, his expression unreadable. "I should go," she said, moving to stand, in the middle of the night, into open country with no supplies. He shook his head. "That's a good way to end up dead by sunrise. I cannot stay near settlements." "This isn't a settlement, it's just me, my horse, and now you." He poked at the fire with a stick. "Name's Henry Blackwood. I run cattle about 40 miles west of here." Prudence hesitated, uncertain of the proper protocol. It had been a long time since she'd been introduced to anyone new. "Prudence Miller," she offered finally. "Where are you headed, Prudence Miller?" he asked, his eyes flickering briefly to where her branded hand lay hidden. "Away," she replied simply. Henry studied her for a long moment. "Running from something or toward something?" "The former." He nodded as if this was answer enough. "Hungry." Before she could respond, he was reaching for a small iron pot nestled in the coals at the fire's edge. The aroma of beans and salt pork made her stomach clench painfully, reminding her she hadn't eaten properly in days. "It's not fancy," he said, spooning a portion into a tin plate. "But it's hot." Prudence accepted the plate with murmured thanks, eating slowly despite her hunger. Henry didn't press her with questions as she ate, for which she was grateful. Instead, he busied himself with tending the fire and checking on his horse, a handsome bay gelding that stood patiently at the edge of the firelight. When she'd finished eating, he took her plate without comment and set it aside with his own. "You should sleep," he said. "Morning comes early out here." "I cannot impose. You're not imposing if you're invited," he cut in. "And I'm inviting you to rest here tonight. Tomorrow we can figure out where you're headed." Prudence wanted to protest, to explain that she was dangerous to be around, that she brought only misfortune. But exhaustion pulled at her limbs, and the fire's warmth was seeping into her bones, making her eyelids heavy. "Thank you," she whispered, settling back down. As sleep claimed her once more, she thought she heard him murmur something in response, but the words were lost to the night. Morning broke clear and cool, the vast Wyoming sky painted in shades of pink and gold. Prudence awoke to the smell of coffee and the soft sounds of movement. Henry was already up, tending to his horse while a small pot of coffee boiled at the edge of the freshly stoked fire. She sat up, wincing at the stiffness in her limbs. Her feet, she noticed, had been bandaged with clean strips of cloth. "Your boots were rubbing you raw," Henry explained when he caught her looking. "Figured it wouldn't hurt to wrap them." "You didn't have to do that," she said, embarrassed by his kindness. "No, I didn't." He handed her a cup of coffee. It was black and strong, but the warmth of it between her palms was welcome. "Looks like you've been on the move for a while," Prudence nodded, sipping cautiously at the hot liquid. 3 days, with no proper supplies," he frowned. "That's not just running away, that's being driven out." She didn't answer, but her silence was confirmation enough. Henry crouched down near the fire, his eyes level with hers. "That mark on your hand," he said quietly. "I've seen it before." Prudence tensed. "Then you know what it means." "I know what some folks think it means." His tone was carefully neutral. "Superstitious nonsense, if you ask me." "It's not nonsense to them," she replied, bitterness creeping into her voice. "To them I'm cursed, dangerous." Henry's expression remained impassive. "And what do you think?" The question caught her off guard. No one had asked for her opinion on the matter, not the town elders, not the doctor, not even Jeremiah. Her feelings had been irrelevant in the face of their certainty. "I think I buried 3 babies," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "And I don't know why God saw fit to take them from me, but I don't believe I'm cursed, just unlucky." Henry nodded slowly, as if her answer satisfied something in him. "Where were you headed before you stumbled onto my camp?" "Nowhere specific, just away from Hollowbrook." "That's not much of a plan." "It wasn't much of a choice," she countered. The ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Fair enough." He stood, brushing dust from his trousers. "I'm headed back to my ranch. It's a 2-day ride from here, longer on foot." He paused, seeming to consider his next words carefully. "You're welcome to come along, at least until you figure out your next move." Prudence stared at him, searching for the catch, the hidden motive. Men didn't offer help without expecting something in return. Especially not to women marked as she was. "Why would you do that?" she asked. "You don't know me." "I know you're alone with no supplies in country that kills the unprepared," he shrugged. "Besides, I could use the help around the place. My last ranch hand left 2 months ago, and it's more work than one man can handle alone. I don't know anything about ranching. Can you cook?" "Yes." "Mend clothes?" "Of course." "Then you already know more than most cowboys I've hired." He offered her a half smile. It's honest work for fair pay. You can stay as long as you like or leave whenever you want. No questions asked. Prudence hesitated, weighing her options. She had nowhere to go, no one to turn to. The little money she had would run out quickly. And while she didn't know this man, he had shown her more kindness in one night than her own community had in years. People will talk, she warned, if they see this. She held up her branded hand. Henry's eyes hardened slightly. Let them. My ranch, my business. Besides, we're pretty isolated. Nearest neighbor is 5 miles away and they mind their own affairs. Prudence took a deep breath. All right, she said, until I figure out where to go next. Henry nodded once, as if sealing a contract. Good, we'll leave within the hour. True to his word, they were on the trail before the sun had fully cleared the eastern horizon. Prudence rode behind Henry on his bay gelding, her small bundle of possessions tied securely to the saddle. She sat stiffly at first, unused to horseback and uncomfortable with the proximity to this stranger. But as the miles stretched on, fatigue and the steady rhythm of the horse's gait gradually relaxed her. Henry wasn't much for conversation, it seemed. He spoke mainly to point out landmarks or to check if she needed to rest. Otherwise, he let the vast landscape speak for itself, the rolling hills and distant mountains telling their own stories. By midday, they had stopped at a small creek to water the horse and stretch their legs. Prudence gratefully slid from the saddle, her thighs aching from the unaccustomed riding. Henry handed her a strip of dried beef and an apple from his saddlebag, then walked a short distance away to give her privacy. As she ate, Prudence studied him covertly. There was an ease to the way he moved, a confidence born of knowing exactly who he was and where he belonged in the world. It was something she had never possessed, not even before her babies had died and the town had turned against her. We'll reach Fallen Creek by nightfall, Henry said, returning to where she sat. It's a good place to make camp, clean water, some shelter from the wind. Is that near your ranch? She asked. About halfway there. We should reach my place by tomorrow evening, assuming the weather holds. He glanced at the sky, assessing the few scattered clouds. Looks promising. Prudence nodded, a sudden nervousness fluttering in her stomach. What was she doing, traveling alone with a man she barely knew to a place she'd never seen? Yet what choice did she have? Death in the wilderness or a chance at survival, however temporary. You're having second thoughts, Henry observed, his eyes keen on her face. Wouldn't you? In my position, he considered this, then nodded. I suppose I would, but I give you my word. You'll be safe at my ranch and free to leave whenever you choose. And if I chose to leave now, then I'd give you half my provisions and point you toward the nearest town that might be more welcoming than the one you left. His expression was serious. But I hope you'll at least give my offer a fair chance. Something in his straightforward manner reassured her. I will, she said. I'm just unused to kindness from strangers. A shadow crossed his face. The world's hard enough without people making it harder for each other. They resumed their journey shortly after, the landscape gradually changing as they rode west. The open plains gave way to more varied terrain, with scattered pine trees and rocky outcroppings breaking up the endless horizon. By late afternoon, the air had cooled, and Prudence found herself leaning slightly into Henry's back for warmth. If he noticed, he made no comment. Instead, he began to point out different plants and landmarks, naming them and occasionally sharing brief stories about the land. It was the most he had spoken all day, and Prudence found herself drawn into his quiet appreciation for the country around them. There, he said finally, gesturing toward a line of cottonwood trees in the distance. Fallen Creek. The creek proved to be a modest but cheerful stream, cutting through a small valley flanked by cottonwoods and willows. It was a welcome sight after the long day's ride, offering both water and shelter. Henry helped Prudence dismount, his hands steady at her waist, then set about making camp with practiced efficiency. Can I help? She asked, feeling useless as she watched him work. You can gather some kindling if you're up to it, he suggested. Smaller sticks, dry leaves, nothing too strenuous. Grateful for the task, Prudence began collecting what she could find near the campsite. Her body ached from riding, but the simple activity helped ease the stiffness in her limbs. By the time she had gathered a decent pile of kindling, Henry had unsaddled the horse and set up their sleeping area beneath a large cottonwood. Working together, they soon had a fire crackling merrily, its warm light pushing back the gathering dusk. Henry prepared a simple meal of bacon, hardtack, and coffee, sharing it with her without ceremony. As they ate, Prudence found herself studying the brand on her hand, the angry sea that had become her identity in the eyes of others. "How did it happen?" Henry asked quietly, noticing her gaze. Prudence hesitated, then decided there was little point in hiding what he would eventually learn. "I was married young at 18. My husband, Jeremiah, was the son of one of the founding families of Hollowbrook. We were happy at first." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "After a year, I became pregnant. We were overjoyed, but in my 7th month, the baby came early, a little boy. He lived only a few hours." The memory still had the power to steal her breath. Everyone was sympathetic. "These things happen," they said. Henry listened silently, his face solemn in the firelight. "The second time I carried to term, a daughter. She seemed healthy at birth, but by morning she was gone." Prudence swallowed hard. "That's when the whispers started. 2 babies lost. People began to look at me differently. Some avoided me altogether. And the third," Henry prompted gently when she fell silent, "the third was another boy. He lived 3 days. Her voice had gone flat, protective. "That's when Elder Thatcher declared me cursed, said I was bringing death into the community. My husband. He didn't defend me. He stood with them when they branded me and drove me out." Henry's jaw tightened, a muscle working in his cheek. "And no one spoke against this," the doctor tried. "Said it was just bad luck, not a curse, but the town was frightened. 3 dead babies in 5 years. They needed someone to blame." She rubbed absently at the scar, "so they blamed me." "That's not justice," Henry said, his voice low with anger. "That's ignorance and cruelty dressed up as righteousness." His vehemence surprised her. "You don't believe in curses, then?" "I believe in science and common sense, not superstition." He set his plate aside. "My mother lost 2 babies before I was born. No one branded her or drove her out. They called it what it was, a tragedy. Your mother was fortunate in her community then. Maybe. Or maybe times are changing too slowly." He poured them both more coffee. "Either way, that mark doesn't mean anything on my land. Remember that." Prudence nodded, a small warmth kindling in her chest that had nothing to do with the fire. It had been so long since someone had looked at her and seen a person, not a walking curse. "Thank you," she said simply. Henry shrugged, uncomfortable with her gratitude. "Get some rest. We've got another long day tomorrow." That night, Prudence slept more soundly than she had in months, wrapped in the blanket Henry had provided and lulled by the gentle sound of the creek nearby. No nightmares came to haunt her, no memories of tiny graves or accusing eyes, just deep, dreamless sleep. Morning arrived with a chorus of birdsong and the rich aroma of coffee. Prudence opened her eyes to find Henry already up and moving about the camp, his back to her as he tended the fire. The early light caught in his dark hair, revealing threads of copper she hadn't noticed before. "Good morning," she said, sitting up. He turned, a brief smile lightening his features. "Morning, sleep well." "Better than I have in a long time," she admitted. "Good, there's coffee ready when you want it." They ate a quick breakfast of leftover bacon and hardtack, then broke camp efficiently. Within an hour, they were back on the trail, the morning sun warm on their backs as they rode westward. The landscape began to change more dramatically as they traveled, the rolling plains giving way to more rugged country. Stands of pine and aspen appeared more frequently, and in the distance, mountains rose blue against the sky. "Is that where your ranch is?" Prudence asked, pointing toward the mountains. "In their shadow," Henry confirmed. "Good grazing land in the foothills, plenty of water. My father chose the spot 20 years ago, said it reminded him of heaven. You grew up there, born and raised, inherited it when he passed 5 years back." "I'm sorry," she said softly. "He lived a good life, died content." Henry's voice held no bitterness. "Can't ask for more than that." As they rode, Henry pointed out various landmarks and shared stories of the area, which creeks never ran dry, which hillsides bloomed with wildflowers in spring, where the best hunting could be found. Prudence listened, trying to memorize the details of this new place that would be her temporary home. By mid-afternoon, the terrain had grown increasingly varied, with rocky outcroppings and small valleys breaking up the landscape. They crested a gentle rise, and Henry reined the horse to a stop. "There it is," he said, gesturing ahead. Blackwood Ranch. Prudence leaned slightly to the side to see past his shoulder. Below them, nestled in a broad valley between pine-covered hills, lay a collection of buildings. A substantial log cabin stood at the center, smoke rising lazily from its stone chimney. Nearby were a large barn, several smaller outbuildings, and corrals where cattle and horses grazed. A creek wound through the property, its banks lined with cottonwoods and willows. Beyond the immediate homestead, the land opened up into rolling pastures where more cattle could be seen grazing. "It's beautiful," she said honestly. "It's home," Henry replied, a note of pride in his voice. He urged the horse forward down the slope toward the ranch. As they approached, Prudence noticed details she hadn't been able to see from a distance. The cabin was larger than she'd first thought, with a covered porch running along its front. The barn was well maintained, its red paint faded but intact. Several fruit trees stood near the cabin, and a fenced garden plot occupied a sunny spot nearby. It was a working ranch, certainly, but also a proper home cared for and lived in. A large dog came bounding from behind the barn as they rode into the yard, barking enthusiastically. Henry dismounted and helped Prudence down, then greeted the dog, a shaggy brown and white creature with mismatched eyes. "This is Bear," he told Prudence as the dog sniffed curiously at her skirts. "Don't let the noise fool you. He's about as dangerous as a rabbit." As if to prove his point, Bear flopped onto his back, tail wagging hopefully. Prudence couldn't help but smile, reaching down to scratch the dog's exposed belly. "He likes you," Henry observed. "That's a good sign. Bear's a fair judge of character." He led her toward the cabin, the dog trotting happily beside them. The porch steps creaked slightly under their weight, and Henry opened the door, gesturing for her to enter first. The interior of the cabin was surprisingly spacious, with a large main room that served as both kitchen and living area. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, a fire burning low in its hearth. Rough-hewn furniture, a table with chairs, a sofa covered in a colorful quilt, bookshelves filled with volumes created a comfortable, if simple, living space. 2 doors led off from the main room, presumably to bedrooms. "It's not fancy," Henry said, watching her take it all in. "But it's solid and warm." "It's lovely," Prudence replied, meaning it. After 3 days in the wilderness and years in a town that had grown increasingly hostile, the cabin felt like a sanctuary. "This will be your room," Henry said, opening one of the doors. Inside was a small but neat bedroom, containing a bed with a patchwork quilt, a chest of drawers, and a small table with a wash basin. A window looked out toward the mountains. "It was my sister's before she married and moved east." "You have a sister?" Prudence asked, surprised. He hadn't mentioned family. "Hannah, she's in Boston now, married to a doctor." A flicker of fondness crossed his face. "She writes regularly, sends books when she can." Prudence set her small bundle of possessions on the bed, feeling simultaneously grateful and overwhelmed. It was more privacy and comfort than she had dared hope for. "Thank you," she said. "This is far more than I expected." "It's nothing fancy," he repeated, seeming uncomfortable with her gratitude. "I'll let you get settled, take your time. I need to see to the horse and check on a few things around the ranch." He left her then, closing the door softly behind him. Prudence sank onto the edge of the bed, her fingers tracing the colorful pattern of the quilt. For the first time in days, perhaps longer, she allowed herself to truly breathe. She wasn't safe, not really. This arrangement was temporary, a brief respite before she would need to move on. But for now, in this moment, she had shelter, food, and the promise of honest work. It was more than she had dared to hope for when she'd been driven from Hollowbrook. After washing her face and hands in the basin and changing into her cleanest dress, which wasn't saying much after days on the trail, Prudence ventured back into the main room. Henry wasn't there, but the fire had been built up, and a pot of something that smelled delicious simmered at its edge. Curious, she lifted the lid. A rich stew of beef, potatoes, and carrots bubbled gently. Her stomach growled in response. Setting the lid back in place, she looked around the kitchen area. It was functional but showed signs of a bachelor's neglect, dishes stacked haphazardly, jars and canisters arranged with no particular order, a layer of dust on the higher shelves. Without thinking too much about it, Prudence began to tidy up. She washed the dishes in the basin of water on the counter, dried them, and arranged them neatly on the shelves. She wiped down surfaces, organized the pantry items, and swept the wooden floor. The simple, familiar tasks soothed her, giving her hands something useful to do while her mind processed all that had happened. She was setting the table when the door opened, and Henry stepped inside, bringing with him the crisp scent of the outdoors. He paused, taking in the transformed kitchen. "You didn't have to do all this," he said. "I wanted to," Prudence replied. "It helps me feel useful." He nodded, accepting this. "The stew should be ready. I'm not much of a cook, but it's hard to ruin a stew. It smells wonderful." She finished setting the table as Henry washed up at the basin. They ate together in a surprisingly comfortable silence, broken occasionally by Henry's explanations of the ranch and its routines. He had about 100 head of cattle, he told her, mostly Herefords, along with a half-dozen horses and the usual assortment of chickens and a milk cow. Spring and fall are the busiest times, he explained. Calving season and then the drive to market. The rest of the year, it's mostly maintenance, keeping fences mended, watching for predators, that sort of thing. And you've been doing all this alone, since your last ranch hand left, more or less. I hire extra hands for the drives and branding, the rest I manage, he shrugged. It keeps me busy. It sounds like more than one person can reasonably handle, Prudence observed. A faint smile touched his lips. Maybe, but reasonable has never been my strong suit. He pushed his empty bowl aside. That was good, better than it usually tastes when I'm eating alone. Company improves most meals, Prudence said, rising to clear the dishes. Leave those, you've done enough for today. He stood, taking the bowls from her hands. You must be tired from the journey. She was, she realized. The long ride and the emotional strain of the past few days were catching up with her. I am a bit. Rest then. Tomorrow will be soon enough to figure out how this arrangement will work. Prudence nodded, grateful for his understanding. Good night then, and thank you again for your kindness. Something unreadable flickered in his eyes. It's not kindness, it's common decency. He turned away, carrying the dishes to the basin. Good night, Prudence. In her room, Prudence changed into her nightgown and slipped beneath the quilt. The bed was softer than she was used to, the pillow smelling faintly of lavender. Outside, she could hear the gentle sounds of the ranch settling for the night, the distant lowing of cattle, the soft whickering of horses, the whisper of wind through the pines. Despite her exhaustion, sleep eluded her for a time. Her mind kept returning to Henry Blackwood, this taciturn cowboy who had offered her shelter and work without question, who looked at her branded hand and saw not a curse but an injustice. He was a puzzle, this man, gruff yet gentle, solitary yet generous. Eventually, the rhythmic sounds of the night and the comfort of the bed lulled her into slumber. Her last conscious thought was that, for the first time in a very long while, she felt something like hope. The next morning, Prudence awoke to sunlight streaming through her window and the aroma of coffee and bacon. For a disorienting moment, she couldn't place where she was. Then memory returned: the banishment, the journey, Henry Blackwood and his ranch. She dressed quickly in her second-best dress, braided her hair, and went to the main room. Henry was at the stove, turning bacon in a cast-iron skillet. He glanced up as she entered. "Morning," he said. "Coffee's ready if you want some." "Thank you." She poured herself a cup, savoring the rich aroma. "Can I help with breakfast? I've got it under control." He transferred the bacon to a plate and cracked eggs into the hot grease. "Not much of a cook, but I can manage breakfast." They ate at the table, Henry outlining his plans for the day between bites. He needed to mend a section of fence where some cattle had broken through, check on a pregnant heifer that seemed close to calving, and repair a leak in the barn roof. "What would you like me to do?" Prudence asked when he'd finished. Henry considered. Whatever you're comfortable with, the house could use a woman's touch, certainly. The garden's been neglected, or if you prefer, you could help me with the outdoor work. I think I'll start with the house and garden, she decided. Though I'm willing to learn ranch work if you're willing to teach me. Something like approval flickered in his eyes. One step at a time, there's no rush. After breakfast, Henry showed her where to find the various supplies she might need: gardening tools in the shed, cleaning materials in the pantry, canned goods and staples for cooking. He seemed almost apologetic about the state of the place. My sister used to keep everything in order, he explained. Since she left, I've focused more on the ranch than the house. It's understandable, Prudence assured him. A ranch this size is more than enough work for one person, he nodded, seeming relieved by her understanding. I'll be back midday for dinner, then out again until supper time. Once Henry had ridden out to check the fences, Prudence set to work in earnest. She began in the kitchen, giving it a thorough cleaning and organizing the pantry. She found flour, sugar, and other baking supplies and made a mental note to bake bread later. The house had a good stock of canned vegetables and preserves, many labeled in a neat feminine hand that she guessed belonged to Henry's sister. By midday, the kitchen and main living area were spotless, and Prudence had prepared a simple but hearty meal of beans, ham, and corn bread. Henry returned right on time, washing up outside before entering the house. Something smells good, he said, hanging his hat on a peg by the door. Just simple fare, Prudence replied, setting plates on the table. I found cornmeal in the pantry and thought corn bread would go well with the beans. They ate together, Henry complimenting her cooking between bites. He told her about the morning's work. The fence was mended, but the pregnant heifer showed no signs of calving yet. I think I'll tackle the garden this afternoon, Prudence said as they finished eating. It looks like it could be quite productive with some care. Hannah always grew enough vegetables to see us through winter, Henry said. I've kept it watered, but not much else. Then that's where I'll start. After Henry had gone back out, Prudence changed into her oldest dress and found a sun bonnet hanging on a peg near the door. The garden plot was larger than it had appeared from a distance, with neat raised beds currently overrun with weeds. A quick inspection revealed that many vegetables were still growing despite the neglect: tomatoes, beans, squash, and root vegetables. Prudence spent the afternoon weeding, pruning, and harvesting what was ripe. The physical labor was satisfying, the feel of soil between her fingers comforting in its familiarity. She had always loved growing things, coaxing life from the earth. It had been one of the few joys left to her after losing her babies. By the time the sun began to dip toward the western mountains, she had filled 2 baskets with vegetables and had the garden looking considerably tidier. Her back ached and her hands were dirty, but it was the good kind of tiredness that came from productive work. She was washing the vegetables at the pump when Henry returned, leading his horse toward the barn. He altered his course to stop beside her, surveying her work with obvious surprise. You've been busy, he observed. The garden was more salvageable than it looked, she replied, gesturing to her harvest. There's plenty here for tonight's supper and more still growing. I'm impressed. He dismounted, leading his horse by the reins. Let me stable Thunder, and I'll help you carry those in. True to his word, he returned moments later and took both baskets from her, insisting over her protests that she'd done enough heavy lifting for one day. Together they walked back to the cabin, the setting sun painting the landscape in hues of gold and amber. It's beautiful here, Prudence said, pausing on the porch to look out over the valley. So peaceful. Henry followed her gaze. It is, sometimes I forget to notice. That happens when you see something every day, I suppose. Maybe, he held the door open for her. Or maybe it takes a new perspective to remind us of what we have. Inside, Prudence washed up and then began preparing supper, a hearty vegetable stew with the last of the bacon for flavor and biscuits from scratch. Henry built up the fire and then sat at the table, whittling a piece of wood while she cooked. The domesticity of the scene struck her suddenly, the two of them in the warm kitchen, the comfortable silence, the simple routines of daily life. It was a glimpse of what her life might have been, had things gone differently. Had her babies lived, had Jeremiah stood by her, had the town not turned against her. "You went somewhere else just now," Henry said quietly, interrupting her thoughts. Prudence glanced up from the biscuit dough she was kneading, just thinking. About Hollowbrook, about what might have been. She dusted flour from her hands. "It's foolish to dwell on it, I know. Not foolish, human." He set aside his whittling. "We all wonder about the paths not taken." His perceptiveness surprised her. "And what paths do you wonder about, Henry Blackwood?" A shadow crossed his face. "Different ones than yours, I imagine." Before she could ask what he meant, he stood and moved to the window, effectively ending the conversation. Prudence returned her attention to the biscuits, sensing he needed the space. Supper was a quiet affair, though not uncomfortably so. Henry complimented her cooking again, and they discussed practical matters, what supplies they might need from town, tasks for the coming days, the approaching autumn, and preparations for winter. "I usually make a trip to Dixon for supplies every few weeks," Henry explained. "It's the nearest town, about a day's ride. I'm due to go in the next week or so." Prudence tensed at the mention of town. "I cannot go with you, I know." His voice was gentle. "I wouldn't expect you to. The mark would be meaningless in Dixon," he interrupted. "It's a cattle town, rough around the edges. They care more about whether your money's good than what's on your hand." He paused. "But I understand your caution. When the time comes, I'll go alone." Prudence nodded, relieved by his understanding. "Thank you." After supper, Henry insisted on helping with the dishes, despite her protests. They worked side by side in companionable silence, Prudence washing while Henry dried. When they finished, he stoked the fire one last time for the night, then retrieved a book from the shelf. "Do you read?" he asked, holding up the volume. "Yes, though it's been some time since I had access to books." He surveyed the bookshelf thoughtfully, then selected a different volume. "You might enjoy this one. My sister sent it last Christmas." Prudence accepted the book, a collection of poetry by Alfred, Lord Tennyson. "Thank you. I haven't read poetry in years." "Neither had I, until Hannah started sending books." A wry smile touched his lips. "She's determined to ensure I don't become completely uncivilized out here." They settled on opposite ends of the sofa, each with their books. The crackling fire and the occasional turning of pages were the only sounds in the room. Prudence found herself repeatedly glancing up from her reading to observe Henry. He read with complete absorption, one hand absently stroking Bear, who had settled at his feet in the warm firelight with his guard down. Henry looked younger, less weathered. She noticed details she had missed before: the slight crook in his nose that suggested it had been broken once, the way his hair curled slightly at his collar, the long, capable fingers that turned the pages with surprising gentleness. He was not classically handsome, but there was an undeniable appeal to his strong features and direct gaze. More than that, there was a solidity to him, a steadiness that Prudence found increasingly comforting. As if sensing her scrutiny, Henry looked up. Their eyes met briefly before Prudence hastily returned her attention to her book, a flush warming her cheeks. The days fell into a rhythm after that. Prudence tended to the house and garden, cooked their meals, and gradually expanded her duties to include feeding the chickens and milking the cow. Henry worked from sunrise to sunset on the endless tasks of the ranch, returning for midday dinner and again for supper. Their evenings developed a pattern as well-shared meals, conversation that grew increasingly easy, and reading by the fire before retiring to their separate rooms. Sometimes Henry would tell her stories of the area, of the early days when his father had first staked his claim, or of the characters he'd known over the years. Prudence found herself looking forward to these quiet evenings more than she cared to admit. A week passed, then two. The garden flourished under Prudence's care, yielding a bounty that she preserved for the coming winter. The house transformed gradually, becoming more of a home than a mere shelter. She found fabric in a chest and sewed new curtains for the windows, darned Henry's worn shirts and socks, and added small touches that brightened the rustic interior. For his part, Henry seemed both surprised and pleased by the changes. He never commented directly on them, but she would catch him looking around the cabin with an expression of quiet satisfaction. He began bringing her small gifts from his days on the range, a particularly beautiful stone, wildflowers that she pressed between the pages of a book, a bird's nest that had fallen from a tree. One evening in late September, as they sat by the fire after supper, Henry cleared his throat. "I need to make that supply run to Dixon tomorrow." Prudence looked up from her mending. "Of course. Do you need me to prepare anything special for your journey?" "No, I'll take what I need." He hesitated. "I should be back by nightfall, but if I'm delayed, don't worry. Sometimes business takes longer than expected." "I'll be fine here," she assured him. "There's plenty to keep me occupied." Henry nodded, seeming relieved. "I've made a list of supplies. Is there anything you need? New fabric, perhaps, or personal items?" His slight discomfort at the last suggestion made Prudence smile despite herself. "Some fabric would be nice if it's not too dear, and perhaps some yarn for knitting. Winter will be here before we know it." "Consider it done." He stood, stretching his tall frame. "I'll leave at first light." True to his word, Henry was gone before Prudence awoke the next morning. She found a note on the table written in a surprisingly neat hand: "Don't forget to feed Bear, back by supper time." The day stretched out before her, oddly empty without Henry's presence. She hadn't realized how accustomed she'd grown to his being near, even when they were engaged in separate tasks. The knowledge that he was just a shout away had become a comfort she hadn't recognized until it was absent. Prudence filled the hours with a thorough cleaning of the cabin, harvesting and preserving more vegetables from the garden, baking bread and pies for Henry's return. By mid-afternoon, she had run out of indoor tasks and ventured out to check on the chickens and milk the cow. She was returning from the barn, milk pail in hand, when she heard hoofbeats approaching. Thinking Henry had returned early, she quickened her pace toward the cabin, but as she rounded the corner, she saw not one rider but three, none of them Henry. Fear clutched at her throat. Strangers. Men. And she was alone. Bear came bounding from beneath the porch, barking a warning. Prudence set down the milk pail and retreated to the cabin door, one hand instinctively covering the brand on her other hand. The riders drew up in the yard, dust settling around them. They were rough-looking men, trail-worn and unshaven. The leader, a stocky man with a scar cutting through his left eyebrow, surveyed the property with narrow eyes before settling his gaze on Prudence. "Afternoon, madam," he called, touching the brim of his hat. "We're looking for Henry Blackwood." "He's not here," Prudence replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "He's gone to Dixon for supplies." The men exchanged glances. "Expected to find him here," the leader said. "I'm Tucker Mills. These are my brothers Silas and Jeb. We've got business with Blackwood." Prudence's unease deepened. "As I said, he's not here. He should return by evening if you care to wait in town." Tucker Mills dismounted, ignoring her suggestion. "We've been riding since dawn. Don't much fancy heading back to Dixon without rest." He eyed the cabin. "Blackwood wouldn't begrudge us some water and a moment's respite, would he?" Before Prudence could respond, all three men had dismounted and were tying their horses to the hitching post. Bear continued to bark, moving between Prudence and the strangers. "Quiet that dog," Tucker ordered, his hand moving significantly toward his gun. "Bear, hush," Prudence commanded, her heart racing. The dog subsided to a low growl but remained at her side. "You can water your horses at the trough. I'll bring you water, but then I must ask you to leave, Mr. Blackwood doesn't welcome uninvited guests when he's away." Tucker's face hardened. "Now that's not very hospitable, is it? Especially from a woman wearing Blackwood's ring." "I'm not," Prudence began, then stopped herself. "Let them think what they wanted if it kept them at a distance. Please water your horses and be on your way." She retreated into the cabin, closing the door firmly behind her. Through the window, she watched as the men led their horses to the water trough. Their body language suggested they were in no hurry to leave. Prudence's mind raced. Should she hide? Run. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and she had no horse. Her gaze fell on Henry's rifle, mounted above the fireplace. She had never fired a gun in her life, but they wouldn't know that. Before she could decide, the door burst open. Tucker Mills stood in the doorway, his brothers flanking him. Bear growled menacingly, but the men ignored him. Nice place Blackwood's got here, Tucker said, stepping inside uninvited. His eyes roamed the cabin, taking in the neat interior. And a pretty wife to come home to, man's got all the luck. I told you to leave, Prudence said, backing toward the fireplace, and I decided not to. Tucker moved further into the room, his brothers following. Blackwood owes us, see, figured we'd wait for him here, maybe enjoy his hospitality in the meantime. Prudence's back hit the stone of the fireplace. She reached up, fingers closing around the cool metal of the rifle. Mr. Blackwood owes you nothing. Leave now or what? Tucker sneered. You'll shoot us all with that rifle you don't know how to use. I know enough, Prudence bluffed, bringing the weapon down and cradling it inexpertly in her arms. Tucker laughed, a harsh sound that sent shivers down her spine. I doubt that very much, Mrs. Blackwood. Now put that down before you hurt yourself. I'm not Mrs. Blackwood, Prudence said, desperate to keep them talking to buy time. For what, she wasn't sure. I'm just the housekeeper. Tucker's eyes narrowed. Housekeeper, out here all alone with a man. He exchanged knowing looks with his brothers. That what they're calling it these days. Shame and anger flooded Prudence. She knew what he was implying, what they all thought. My arrangement with Mr. Blackwood is none of your concern. Now leave. I don't think so. Tucker took another step forward. If you're just the housekeeper, then Blackwood won't mind if we make ourselves comfortable until he returns. Bear chose that moment to lunge, teeth bared. He caught Tucker's arm, tearing through his sleeve. The man roared in pain and anger, backhanding the dog with his free arm. Bear yelped and staggered sideways. No, Prudence cried, instinctively raising the rifle higher. Tucker drew his gun, aiming not at her but at Bear. Call off your dog or I'll put a bullet in him. Bear, stop, Prudence commanded, her voice shaking. The dog retreated to her side, still growling low in his throat. Smart choice, Tucker said, holstering his weapon. Now put down that rifle before someone gets hurt. Prudence's arms trembled with the weight of the weapon and the force of her fear. She knew she should comply. She had no real chance against 3 armed men, but something in her rebelled at the thought of surrendering her only protection. I said, put it down, Tucker repeated, his voice hardening. I believe the lady asked you to leave. The new voice came from the doorway, deep and cold as winter. All eyes turned to see Henry Blackwood standing there, his stance casual but his hand resting on the gun at his hip. His eyes, usually warm brown, had gone hard as flint. Blackwood, Tucker acknowledged, his demeanor shifting subtly. We were just getting acquainted with your housekeeper. So I see. Henry's gaze flicked to Prudence, assessing her condition with a quick glance before returning to Tucker. Now you can get unacquainted. Get out. Tucker's jaw tightened. We have business to discuss. Any business between us can be conducted in town during daylight hours with witnesses. Henry hadn't moved from the doorway, but something in his posture had changed, a coiling of potential energy. Not in my home, with you threatening a woman under my protection. We weren't threatening, Silas Mills spoke up for the first time, his voice higher than his brother's. Just waiting for you to return, uninvited, after being asked to leave. Henry's voice remained dangerously calm. That's trespassing where I come from. A tense silence fell over the cabin. Prudence stood frozen, the rifle still clutched in her trembling hands, Bear pressed against her leg. The Mills brothers exchanged glances, some unspoken communication passing between them. Finally, Tucker nodded. All right, Blackwood, we'll go, but this business between us isn't finished. It is for today, Henry replied. He stepped aside, a clear invitation for them to exit. The brothers filed out, Tucker pausing briefly beside Henry. Your housekeeper has spirit, he said, low enough that Prudence could barely hear. Better keep a close eye on her. Henry's expression didn't change, but his hand tightened visibly on his gun. Tucker smirked and continued out. Only when the sound of hoofbeats had faded into the distance did Henry move, crossing the room to Prudence in long strides. Gently, he took the rifle from her unresisting hands and set it aside. Are you hurt? He asked, his eyes searching her face. No, she managed, though her voice sounded distant to her own ears. They didn't. They just frightened me and Bear. She looked down at the dog, who was licking a small cut on his leg. One of them struck him when he tried to protect me. Henry crouched to examine the dog. "It's not deep, he'll be fine." He stood again, his gaze intense. "What happened exactly?" Prudence recounted the encounter, her voice steadying as she spoke. Henry listened without interrupting, his expression growing darker with each detail. "I shouldn't have left you alone," he said when she'd finished. "The Mills brothers have a reputation. I never thought they'd come here." "What do they want with you?" Henry sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It's a long story. The short version is that their father and mine had a dispute over water rights years ago. Old man Mills never accepted the court's ruling in our favor. His sons have carried on the grudge." "That's all, a water dispute. Out here, water is life." Henry moved to the window, scanning the landscape as if ensuring the brothers had truly gone. "They've been trying to push me into selling for years. Lately, they've gotten more aggressive, cut fences, scattered cattle. Nothing I could prove was them, though everyone knows." Prudence joined him at the window. "Will they come back? Not today, maybe not tomorrow, but eventually." He turned to her, his expression troubled. "This puts you in a difficult position. I never meant to bring trouble to your door." "It's not your trouble," Prudence said firmly. "It's theirs, and I'm not afraid." It was only as she said it that she realized it was true. The fear had receded, replaced by a steady resolve. Henry studied her face, something like admiration flickering in his eyes. "You should be." "They're dangerous men. So are you when you need to be," she observed. "I saw your face when you came in. You would have killed them if they'd harmed me." He didn't deny it. "I promised you'd be safe here. And I am." She touched his arm lightly, a gesture of reassurance. "They're gone. We're both unharmed, and now I'm forewarned." Henry covered her hand with his own, his palm warm and rough against her skin. "I won't leave you alone again, not until this is resolved." The intensity in his voice stirred something in Prudence, a fluttering sensation beneath her ribs that had nothing to do with fear. She became acutely aware of how close they were standing, of the warmth of his hand on hers, of the concern in his dark eyes. "How will it be resolved?" She asked, her voice softer than she'd intended. "I don't know yet." His thumb moved almost imperceptibly against her wrist. "But it will be, I promise you that." The moment stretched between them, charged with something Prudence wasn't ready to name. Then Henry released her hand and stepped back, breaking the spell. "I should bring in the supplies," he said, his voice returning to its usual practical tone. "The wagon's still outside." Prudence nodded, glad for the return to normalcy. "I'll help." They spent the next hour unloading the wagon and storing the supplies: flour, sugar, coffee, canned goods, tools, fabric, and other necessities. Henry had remembered everything on her list and added a few surprises: a bolt of pretty blue calico, several skeins of wool yarn in rich colors, and a book of household management that looked new. "I thought you might find it useful," he said when she opened the book. "The shopkeeper's wife recommended it." "It's perfect," Prudence said, touched by his thoughtfulness. "Thank you." That evening, after a simple supper of cold chicken and bread, Prudence's elaborate cooking plans having been disrupted by the Mills brothers' visit, they sat by the fire as usual. But the easy companionship of previous evenings had been replaced by a palpable tension. Henry was unusually quiet, his expression distant as he stared into the flames. Prudence tried to focus on her new book, but her mind kept returning to the day's events, the fear she'd felt when the brothers entered the cabin, the cold fury in Henry's eyes when he confronted them, the warmth of his hand on hers afterward. "You're thinking too loudly," Henry said finally, breaking the silence. Prudence looked up, startled. "I'm sorry. You haven't turned a page in 15 minutes. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Whatever you're worrying about, just ask." She closed the book, setting it aside. "What will you do about the Mills brothers?" Henry sighed, leaning forward to poke at the fire. "What I've always done. Stay vigilant, protect what's mine, and avoid direct confrontation when possible. And when it's not possible, then I do what needs doing." His voice had hardened slightly. "I'm not a violent man, Prudence, but I will defend what's mine." The possessive words sent an unexpected shiver through her. "They think I'm your wife," she said quietly. "Tucker Mills called me Mrs. Blackwood." Henry's head snapped up, his eyes meeting hers. "I'm sorry for that, for any." Impropriety, it might suggest. It's not that. Prudence hesitated, searching for the right words. It's that they might see me as a way to get to you, a vulnerability. Understanding dawned in his expression. You're worried they'll come back when I'm not here, target you to hurt me. Yes. Henry was silent for a long moment, considering. You could leave, he said finally, though the words seemed to cost him. Go somewhere safer. I could arrange passage to a larger town, somewhere you could start fresh. The suggestion caught Prudence off guard. Leave. The thought sent a cold spike of dread through her. In the weeks she'd been at Blackwood Ranch, it had become more of a home than anywhere she'd lived since childhood. The idea of starting over again, alone in a strange place, was suddenly unbearable. No, she said firmly, I don't want to leave. Relief flickered across Henry's face before he masked it. It might be safer. Safety isn't everything. Prudence met his gaze steadily. I've spent years being careful, doing what others thought best for me. Look where it got me. She held up her branded hand. I'm done running. This is my home now, too. Something shifted in Henry's expression, a softening around his eyes. I won't argue with you, he said quietly, but I need you to be prepared, to know how to protect yourself if I'm not here. Teach me then. The next morning after breakfast, Henry took Prudence behind the barn where he had set up several empty cans on a fence rail. He handed her his revolver, showing her how to hold it properly, how to aim, how to brace for the recoil. It's heavier than I expected, Prudence said, adjusting her grip. You'll get used to it. Henry stood close behind her, adjusting her stance with gentle hands on her shoulders. Widen your feet a bit. There. Now breathe in, aim, and squeeze the trigger on the exhale. Prudence followed his instructions, squeezing her eyes shut at the last moment. The gun kicked in her hand, the report deafening in the quiet morning. She opened her eyes to see all the cans still standing on the rail. I missed, she said, disappointed. Everyone does it first. Henry's voice held no judgment. Try again. This time keep your eyes open. They practiced for an hour, until Prudence's arms ached from the weight of the gun and her ears rang from the shots. By the end, she had managed to hit 3 of the 6 cans, which Henry declared a good start. You have a steady hand, he said as they walked back to the cabin. You'll improve with practice. I hope I never have to use it for real, Prudence admitted. So do I. Henry's expression was solemn, but better to have the skill and not need it than the reverse. The gun lessons continued daily after that, expanding to include the rifle as well. Prudence proved to be a quick study, her initial fear of the weapons giving way to a grudging respect for their utility. By the end of the week, she could hit a target consistently with both revolver and rifle, and Henry had begun teaching her about loading and cleaning the weapons. Meanwhile, life on the ranch continued its steady rhythm. October arrived, bringing cooler temperatures and the first hints of autumn color to the landscape. Prudence finished harvesting the garden and began preparations for winter canning, preserving, mending clothes, and knitting warm socks and scarves from the yarn Henry had brought from town. There had been no further sign of the Mills brothers, but their visit had changed something in the atmosphere of the ranch. Henry was more watchful, more protective. He rarely went far from the cabin, and never without telling Prudence exactly where he would be and when he would return. At night, he checked and rechecked the locks on doors and windows before retiring. For her part, Prudence found herself hyper-aware of sounds and movements outside the cabin. She kept the revolver within reach when Henry was out, though she still prayed she would never need to use it. And she noticed, with a mixture of guilt and pleasure, that she looked for excuses to be near Henry, to work alongside him, to extend their evening conversations by the fire. One crisp October evening, as they sat reading after supper, Henry closed his book with a decisive snap. "It's your birthday tomorrow," he said without preamble. Prudence looked up, startled. "How did you know that? You mentioned it once, weeks ago. Said you were born on the first day of October." He shrugged, a slight flush coloring his cheekbones. "I remembered." "I didn't think you were listening," she admitted. "It was just idle conversation. I listened to everything you say." The simple statement hung in the air between them, weighted with unspoken meaning. Prudence felt a warmth spread through her chest. "I don't expect any recognition of the day." "It's just another day." "Not to me." Henry stood, moving to the window where the first stars were appearing in the darkening sky. "I thought we might ride up to Eagle Point tomorrow. It's about an hour's ride from here. The view is worth seeing." The invitation surprised her. In all the weeks she'd been at the ranch, they had never ventured far from the property together. "What about the ranch, the chores?" "The ranch will survive one day without constant attention." He turned back to her, his expression uncharacteristically uncertain. "Unless you'd prefer not to go." "No, I'd like that very much," Prudence said quickly. "I just didn't want to disrupt your work." A small smile curved his lips. "Some disruptions are worth it." The next morning dawned clear and cool, the sky a brilliant blue unmarred by clouds. Prudence dressed with special care in her best dress, the blue calico Henry had brought from town, which she had quickly sewn into a simple but flattering garment. She braided her hair and pinned it up, then added a touch of rose water she had found in a forgotten bottle in the chest of drawers. When she emerged from her room, Henry was waiting by the door, dressed in clean clothes with his hair neatly combed. He held a small package wrapped in brown paper. "Happy birthday," he said, handing it to her. Prudence accepted the gift with surprise. "You didn't have to, I wanted to." He gestured for her to open it. Inside the package was a delicate silver locket on a fine chain. Simple but elegant, it gleamed in the morning light. Prudence lifted it carefully, touched beyond words by the unexpected gift. "Henry, it's beautiful," she whispered. "But it must have cost." "It doesn't matter what it cost," he interrupted gently. "Do you like it?" "I love it," she said honestly. "Will you help me put it on?" Henry stepped behind her, taking the necklace from her hands. His fingers brushed the nape of her neck as he fastened the clasp, sending a shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with the cool morning air. "There," he said, his voice low near her ear. "Perfect." She turned to face him, one hand rising to touch the locket where it rested against her collarbone. "Thank you, I'll treasure it always." Something flickered in his eyes, an emotion too complex to name, then he stepped back, gesturing toward the door. "The horses are ready whenever you are." They rode out together just as the sun was clearing the eastern hills, Henry on Thunder and Prudence on a gentle mare named Daisy. The morning was glorious, the air crisp and scented with pine, the landscape painted in the rich hues of early autumn. As they rode, Henry pointed out landmarks and shared stories of the area. Much as he had during their journey to the ranch months before, Prudence listened, asking questions and offering observations of her own. She had grown more comfortable on horseback over the weeks, though she still lacked Henry's easy grace in the saddle. Nevertheless, she enjoyed the freedom of movement, the feeling of covering ground under her own power after so long being confined to the ranch. They reached Eagle Point around mid-morning. It was, as Henry had promised, worth seeing a rocky promontory that jutted out from a hillside, offering a panoramic view of the valley below and the mountains beyond. Prudence gasped softly as they dismounted and walked to the edge. "It's magnificent," she said, gazing out at the landscape spread before them. The ranch was visible in the distance, a collection of tiny buildings nestled in the Golden Valley. Beyond it, the land rolled away toward the blue mountains on the horizon. "My father brought me here when I was a boy," Henry said, standing beside her. "Said a man should know what he's fighting for, what he's protecting." Prudence glanced at him. His profile was strong against the sky, his expression thoughtful as he surveyed his domain. "And what are you fighting for, Henry?" He turned to meet her gaze. "It's changed over the years," he said quietly. "Once, it was just the land, the ranch my father built. Then it was a promise to keep his legacy alive, to make something of myself worthy of his name. And now?" Prudence asked, her heart beating faster at the intensity in his eyes. "Now." He paused, seeming to search for words. "Now there's more at stake." Before she could ask what he meant, he moved away, retrieving a bundle from his saddlebag. "I brought food, thought we could have a picnic." The moment had passed, but Prudence felt its echoes in the careful way Henry spread the blanket on a flat portion of rock, in the gentle brush of his fingers against hers as he handed her a plate, in the way his eyes lingered on her face when he thought she wasn't looking. They ate a simple but delicious meal: cold chicken, bread, cheese, apples, and a special treat of store-bought cookies that Henry had been saving for the occasion. After they had finished, they sat side by side on the blanket, looking out over the valley in companionable silence. "Thank you for bringing me here," Prudence said finally. "It's been a perfect birthday." Henry nodded, his eyes on the distant horizon. "I'm glad. You deserve perfect days." There was something in his tone that made her turn to study his face. "Is something troubling you?" He was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. Then, without looking at her, he said, "I received a letter in town last week from my sister in Boston." "Is she well?" Prudence asked, concerned by his serious expression. "She's fine, thriving, actually." He hesitated. "She wants me to visit, says it's been too long since we've seen each other." "Oh," Prudence felt a cold knot form in her stomach. "That would be a long journey. Months round trip." Henry turned to look at her directly. "I've always declined before. The ranch needs constant attention, and I've never had anyone I trusted to leave in charge." Prudence nodded, trying to ignore the sick feeling of dread growing within her. Of course he would go. Family was important, and his sister was his only living relative, and where would that leave her? Alone at the ranch, that seemed unlikely given the threat of the Mills brothers. Would he ask her to leave before he departed, find her a position somewhere else? "When will you go?" she asked, keeping her voice steady with effort. "I'm not," Henry said simply. I wrote back declining. Relief washed over her, followed immediately by guilt. "Because of me, because of what happened with the Mills brothers." "Partly," he admitted. "I wouldn't leave you alone with that threat hanging over us, but it's more than that." He shifted on the blanket, turning to face her more directly. "Prudence, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." Her heart stuttered in her chest. "Of course." "Are you happy here?" His eyes searched hers, intense and serious. "Truly happy, not just making the best of your circumstances?" The question caught her off guard. She had been so focused on being useful, on proving her worth, that she hadn't stopped to consider her own happiness. But now, faced with Henry's direct inquiry, the answer came easily. "Yes," she said softly. "I am happy here, happier than I've been in a very long time." Something in his expression eased, a tension she hadn't fully registered until it was gone. "Good, that's good. Why do you ask?" Henry took a deep breath, as if steeling himself. "Because I need to know if what I'm about to say is welcome or unwelcome." Prudence's pulse quickened. "And what are you about to say?" "That I don't want you to leave, ever." The words came out in a rush, as if he'd been holding them back for a long time. "That in these past months you've become essential to me, not just as a housekeeper or a friend, but as everything." Prudence sat very still, afraid to breathe lest she break whatever spell had come over Henry Blackwood, this man of few words who was suddenly speaking from his heart. "I know it's too soon," he continued when she didn't respond. "I know you've suffered losses I can't imagine and betrayals that would make anyone wary, and I know that what I'm offering isn't nearly enough to make up for all you've lost." "Henry," Prudence began, but he held up a hand. "Please, let me finish. I need to say this properly." He reached for her hand, cradling it between both of his. "Prudence Miller, I'm asking you to stay, not as my housekeeper, not as my friend, but as my wife. I'm asking you to let me call you wife, not cursed, to let me love you as you deserve to be loved for as long as we both shall live." Tears filled Prudence's eyes, blurring her vision. She blinked them away, needing to see his face clearly. "Henry, you don't need to answer now," he said quickly. "Take all the time you need, think about it. And know that whatever your answer, you have a home with me for as long as you want it." Prudence shook her head, a smile breaking through her tears. "I don't need time," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "My answer is yes. Yes, I will stay. Yes, I will be your wife." For a moment, Henry looked stunned, as if he hadn't dared to hope for such an immediate acceptance. Then his face transformed, joy breaking across his features like the sunrise. Without a word, he drew her into his arms, holding her as if she were the most precious thing in the world. Prudence leaned into his embrace, her heart so full it felt as if it might burst. Here, in the circle of his arms, she had found something she had thought forever lost to her, a sense of belonging, of rightness, of home. "I love you," Henry whispered against her hair. "I think I have since the moment you faced down those 3 men with a rifle you didn't know how to use." Prudence laughed softly, pulling back just far enough to see his face. I love you too. Though I think it started earlier for me when you stopped your horse for a stranger dying of thirst and offered her water without judgment. Henry's hands came up to frame her face, his touch gentle as he brushed away the last traces of her tears with his thumbs. May I kiss you? He asked, his voice husky. In answer, Prudence leaned forward, closing the distance between them. His lips met hers, tentative at first, then with growing confidence as she responded. It was a kiss both tender and passionate, a promise and a celebration all at once. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Henry rested his forehead against hers. Happy birthday, Prudence Blackwood, he said softly. His name, sent a thrill through her. Say it again, she whispered. Prudence Blackwood. He smiled against her lips. My wife. Not cursed, never cursed. Just mine as I am yours. They were married 2 weeks later in the small church in Dixon, with only the preacher and his wife as witnesses. Prudence wore her blue calico dress and carried wildflowers Henry had gathered that morning. Henry wore his best shirt and a new vest he'd purchased specifically for the occasion. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt, their vows spoken with quiet conviction. If the preacher noticed the brand on Prudence's hand, he made no comment. In Dixon, as Henry had predicted, people minded their own business. After the ceremony, they shared a meal at the town's only hotel, a luxury Prudence had not experienced in years before riding back to the ranch, to their home. The threat of the Mills brothers still hung over them, but it seemed distant on that golden autumn day, unable to touch the joy they had found in each other. And when they arrived at the ranch to find Bear waiting eagerly on the porch, and the familiar landscape bathed in the warm light of late afternoon, Prudence felt a sense of rightness so profound it brought tears to her eyes. Welcome home, Mrs. Blackwood, Henry said, helping her down from her horse. It's good to be home, she replied, her hand finding his as they walked together toward the cabin door. That night, as they lay together in what was now their shared bedroom, Henry's arms around her and his heartbeat steady beneath her cheek, Prudence felt the last of her old fears finally release their hold. She was no longer alone, no longer cursed, no longer defined by what she had lost. Here in this place, with this man, she had found not just shelter but love, not just survival but life. And as she drifted toward sleep, Prudence Blackwood knew with bone-deep certainty that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. Winter came early that year, blanketing the ranch in snow by mid-November. The world outside grew quiet, the days shorter, the nights long and cold. But inside the Blackwood cabin, there was warmth and light and laughter. Henry and Prudence settled into the rhythms of married life with a naturalness that surprised them both, as if they had always been meant to share this life, this home, this love. The Mills brothers made one more attempt to intimidate them, appearing at the ranch in early December while Henry was checking the cattle in the north pasture. This time, however, Prudence was prepared. She met them on the porch with Henry's rifle held confidently in her hands, Bear at her side, and informed them in no uncertain terms that they were trespassing and would be treated accordingly if they didn't leave immediately. Something in her stance, in the steady way she held the rifle, must have convinced them she meant business. They rode away, muttering threats, but Prudence knew they had seen something they hadn't expected, not a vulnerable woman alone, but a formidable protector of her home. When Henry returned and heard what had happened, his face darkened with anger, then softened with pride. "You're a remarkable woman, Prudence Blackwood," he said, gathering her into his arms. "I had a good teacher," she replied, nestling against his chest, "in more ways than one." The Mills brothers didn't return after that. Whether they had finally accepted defeat or simply decided to bide their time, Prudence couldn't say. But as winter deepened and the ranch remained peaceful, the threat they represented receded further into the background of her thoughts. Spring arrived with its usual rush of activity. Calving season kept them both busy from dawn till dusk, with new life appearing daily in the pastures. Prudence threw herself into the work alongside Henry, learning everything she could about the rhythms and requirements of ranch life. She discovered a talent for animal husbandry, a gentle touch that calmed nervous mothers and strengthened weak calves. "You were born for this," Henry told her one evening as they walked back from the barn together, tired but satisfied after a long day's work. "I've never seen someone take to ranch life so naturally." Prudence smiled, warmed by his praise. "I've had an excellent guide," she said, squeezing his hand, "and I love it here, every part of it." As spring turned to summer, Prudence began to notice changes in her own body, a persistent fatigue, a sensitivity to certain smells, a tenderness in her breasts. At first, she dismissed these symptoms, afraid to hope. But when her monthly time failed to appear for the second month in a row, she could no longer deny the possibility. She waited another week before telling Henry, needing to be certain, needing to protect herself and him from the devastation of another loss. But as the signs became unmistakable, she finally gathered her courage one evening as they sat together on the porch, watching the sunset paint the valley in gold and crimson. "Henry," she began, her voice soft in the evening quiet, "I have something to tell you." He turned to her, his expression open and attentive. "What is it, love?" Prudence took a deep breath, her hand unconsciously moving to rest on her still flat stomach. "I'm with child." For a moment, Henry went completely still, his eyes widening as he processed her words. Then his gaze dropped to where her hand rested, and a complex mix of emotions crossed his face: joy, concern, fear, hope. "You're certain?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Prudence nodded. "As certain as I can be without a doctor's confirmation. All the signs are there." Henry's hand covered hers where it lay on her abdomen, his touch gentle, almost reverent. "A baby," he said, wonder in his voice. Then, as if suddenly remembering her past, his expression sobered. "Prudence, are you afraid?" The question touched her deeply, evidence of how well he had come to know her, how carefully he considered her feelings. "Yes," she admitted, "I am afraid. I can't help but remember what happened before." Henry nodded, his thumb moving in a comforting circle against her hand. "That's natural. But this time is different. You're different. We're different." "I know that in my head," Prudence said. "My heart will take longer to convince. Then I'll remind it every day." He leaned forward, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. "This child is a blessing, not a curse. And whatever happens, we face it together." The months that followed were a mixture of joy and anxiety for Prudence. As her body changed, her belly rounding with new life, she alternated between excitement and fear, between planning for the future and protecting herself against potential heartbreak. Henry was her constant support, never dismissing her concerns but never allowing her to dwell in darkness either. When the baby quickened, fluttering beneath her heart like a bird taking wing, Prudence wept with a complex mixture of emotions: grief for the children she had lost, joy for this new life growing within her, fear that history might repeat itself. Henry held her through the tears, his steady presence an anchor in the storm of her feelings. As her time drew near, Henry insisted on riding to Dixon to fetch the doctor's wife, Mrs. Harmon, who served as midwife to the surrounding ranches. The older woman arrived a week before Prudence's expected time, bringing with her a calm competence that helped ease some of Prudence's fears. "You're healthy as a horse," Mrs. Harmon declared after examining her, "and the baby is positioned perfectly. Everything looks just as it should." Still, as the days passed and the first pangs of labor began, Prudence couldn't shake the memories of her previous deliveries, the pain, the fear, the devastating silence where a baby's cry should have been. Henry remained by her side as long as Mrs. Harmon would allow, his face calm but his eyes betraying his concern. "I'll be right outside," he promised as the midwife finally shooed him from the room. "I love you, Prudence, both of you." The labor was long and difficult, stretching through the night and into the following day. Prudence drew on reserves of strength she hadn't known she possessed, focusing on Mrs. Harmon's steady instructions and the thought of Henry waiting anxiously just beyond the door. As the sun was setting on the second day, with one final, tremendous effort, Prudence brought her daughter into the world. The sound of the baby's first cry, strong, indignant, and gloriously alive, broke something open inside her, a dam of fear and grief giving way to overwhelming joy. "She's perfect," Mrs. Harmon announced, cleaning and swaddling the infant with practiced efficiency. "A beautiful, healthy girl." When Henry was finally allowed to enter, his face pale with worry and exhaustion, Prudence was propped up in bed, their daughter nestled in her arms. The look that crossed his face at the sight of them, wonder, love, and a fierce protectiveness, was one Prudence knew she would remember until her dying day. "Come meet your daughter," she said softly, her voice hoarse from labor but filled with quiet triumph. Henry approached the bed with almost reverent steps, sinking to his knees beside it to gaze at the tiny bundle in her arms. The baby had a cap of dark hair and her father's straight nose, her tiny face still red and wrinkled from birth. "She's miraculous," he whispered, reaching out a tentative finger to touch the baby's cheek. "Just like her mother." Tears filled Prudence's eyes. "We did it, Henry. She's here. She's alive." "Of course she is," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "She's a Blackwood, strong like her mother." They named her Hannah Hope Blackwood, after Henry's sister, and the feeling that had sustained them through the anxious months of waiting. And as the days passed and Hannah thrived, growing stronger and more alert with each sunrise, the last of Prudence's fear began to recede, replaced by a cautious but deepening joy. The Mills brothers made one final appearance at the ranch when Hannah was 6 weeks old. This time they came not with threats, but with news they were selling their property and moving west to California. Their father had died, and with him, apparently, the grudge that had driven their harassment. "Figured you should know," Tucker Mills said gruffly, standing awkwardly in the yard while Henry watched him with wary eyes. "No more trouble from us." "Glad to hear it," Henry replied neutrally. "Safe travels to you." As they rode away for the last time, Prudence stood in the doorway with Hannah in her arms, watching the dust settle in their wake. "Do you think they mean it?" she asked as Henry joined her on the porch. "About no more trouble, I think so," Henry said, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "Some grudges burn themselves out eventually, and California's a long way from here." Prudence leaned into his embrace, Hannah nestled securely between them. "Good," she said simply. "I prefer peace." As Hannah grew from infant to toddler, bringing laughter and chaos to the once quiet cabin, Prudence sometimes found herself marveling at the journey that had brought her to this place, this life, this love. From the desolation of banishment to the fullness of family, from curse to blessing, it seemed almost too much good fortune for one lifetime. When Hannah was 18 months old, Prudence discovered she was expecting again. This time, the news brought more joy than fear, though a shadow of anxiety still lingered in the corners of her heart. Henry's steady support and Hannah's exuberant presence helped keep the darker thoughts at bay. Their son, James Henry Blackwood, arrived on a crisp autumn day, his entry into the world considerably smoother than his sister's had been. He had Prudence's fair coloring and calm temperament, a peaceful baby who watched the world with serious eyes. With 2 healthy children and a thriving ranch, the Blackwoods' cup truly ran over. They added rooms to the cabin as their family grew, planted more fruit trees, expanded the garden. The brand on Prudence's hand faded over the years, the scar tissue softening, the letter C becoming less distinct. She no longer hid it, though the sight of it sometimes still brought a pang of remembrance for the babies she had lost, the ones who would always be missing from their family circle. On the 5th anniversary of their wedding, as they sat together on the porch watching Hannah and James play in the yard with Bear's puppies, Henry took Prudence's hand in his thumb tracing the faded brand. "You ever regret it?" he asked quietly. "Coming here, staying, taking a chance on us?" Prudence shook her head, her heart full as she looked at their children, their home, the life they had built together. "Never," she said firmly, "not for a single moment." Henry lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to the scarred palm. "Nor I," he said. "Every day I thank whatever twist of fate brought you to my campfire that night." "It wasn't fate," Prudence said, leaning against his shoulder. "It was thirst." Henry laughed, the sound mingling with the children's shrieks of delight as one of the puppies escaped the yard and had to be chased down. Then I thank thirst and desperation, and even those narrow-minded fools in Hollowbrook. Without them, I might never have found you. And I might never have found myself, Prudence added softly, the woman I was meant to be. As the sun set over Blackwood Ranch, painting the sky in shades of fire and gold, Prudence Blackwood knew with absolute certainty that she had found her place in the world. Not as a wife, not as a mother, not as a rancher's partner, though she was all these things and valued each role deeply, but as herself, complete and whole, no longer defined by loss or marked by others' fear, but by the love she gave and received freely. The curse that had once defined her had become a blessing beyond measure. And as she sat beside the man who had first seen her worth, watching their children play in the golden light of evening, Prudence silently thanked God for the journey that had brought her home.